So now we're going to look at least common multiple. And the least common multiple is the smallest number that is a multiple of two numbers. So we're going to get to that in a second, but let's talk about what multiples are first. So multiples are just the numbers when you talk about your multiply 1 times a number, then 2 times a number, then 3 times a number. So the multiples of 5 are going to be 5, then 10, then 15, then 20. Multiples of 6 are going to be 6, 12, 18, 24. Multiples of 50 are going to be 50, 100, 150, and 200. So you just keep on adding more and more, and you're going to keep getting more and more multiples. So each time you're multiplying by 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, and so on. So if you do that, you've got a multiple of a number. So that's the first thing. So the least common multiple is the smallest number that's a multiple of two numbers. So what I mean by that is this. If we just list this, so 10, if we want to list the first few multiples of 10, we're going to get 10, 20, 30, 40, and then 50. If we list the first few multiples of 25, we're going to end with 25, 50, 75, 100. So what you'll notice is that I've got two numbers here that are the same. I've got 50 here and 50 here. That is the least common multiple. It's the smallest number that's a multiple of two numbers. So one more here. What we have here is we have 18 and 24, and we're trying to figure out the greatest common factor of both of those numbers. So if you look here, again, 18 is going to be 2 times 3 times 3. 24 is going to be 2 times 2 times 2 times 3. Now if I break this down, I'm going to go ahead and go, okay, well I got a pair here of 2's and I've got a pair of 3's here. So that's going to be 2 times 3. And that means that 6 is the greatest common factor of both 18 and 24. That makes sense because 6 times 3 is 18 and 6 times 4 is 24. So here we're going to look back at a problem we did previously when we were talking about greatest common factor. Here instead, we had the prime factorization of 18 and 24. That's what these two things are right down here and here. So what I'm going to look for, another way of doing the least common multiple is to look at all the factors that are shared and then multiply it out in a particular way. So if you look here, I've got one set of 2's. I'm going to write this up here in blue. I've got one set of 2's. That's my part here. I've got a set of 3's. Then I've got these other numbers here. If I was to just do greatest common factor, I'd be done. 6 would be the greatest common factor. But I've got to include this 2, and this other 3. So when I multiply them all together, that's actually going to be my least common multiple. And so when I multiply them all together, I do 2 times 3, that's 6. Then 6 times 2, that's 12. Then 12 times 2, that's 24. Then 24 times 3, that's going to give me 72. That is the smallest number that both of these numbers divide into. So actually 24 times 3 is 72, and 18 times 4 is 72. But that's the smallest number that both of those go into, so that's the least common multiple. And this is a way of doing it using prime factorization. So here's another example. I broke it down again for 170. What's the biggest number that divides into both? Again, it might come to you immediately, it's going to be 10, because that's a pretty big number and divides into both. But if it doesn't, then what you can do is you can prime factorize them. So if you look here, 100 is going to be 2 times 2 times 5 times 5. 70 is going to be 2 times 5 times 7. So again, what factors do they share? they share a 2, and they share a 5. So to figure out what the biggest factor that both of them share, we're just going to multiply 2 times 5, which is going to give you 10. And that makes sense because 10 times 10 is 100, and 10 times 7 equals 70. So here we've got another problem here. If you remember, we did 170, and the greatest common factor was just going to be 10 because they share a 2 and they share a 5. But now I'm going to rewrite this a little bit differently, like in the previous slide. So I count this 2, the shared 2. I count the 5, the shared 5. Then I got to deal with this, this, and this. So I'm going to multiply by 2 again, then by 5, then by 7. So when I multiply all that, 2 times 5, that's 10, times 2, that's going to be 20, times 5, that's going to be 100, times 7, that's going to be 700. And that's going to be my least common multiple. That's the smallest number that both 70 and 100 go into. Because 100 times 7 is 700, and 70 times 10 is also 700. So today we're going to review what the greatest common factor is of a couple of different numbers. So the greatest common factor is the biggest number that is a factor of two numbers. What I did here was I went ahead and I prime factorized 32 and I prime factorized 20. I've already talked about how to do that, just breaking it down into prime numbers. So 32 is 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. That's what that says right there. And 20 is 2 times 2 times 5. Now if you look at the list down here, we've got some shared factors. One shared factor is a pair of 2's. Another shared factor is another pair of 2's. And now we don't have any more shared factors. We have 3 2's on top and 1 5 on the bottom. So if I want to figure out what the greatest common factor is of these two numbers, I just multiply these two 2's together. There are factors for both. So what I end up with as an answer is 4. That's the greatest common factor of both of these numbers, because 4 times 8 equals 32, and 4 times 5 equals 20. So one more example here. I've got 32 and 20. Looking back down here, I'm going to write this one way up at the top. I've got one set of 2's that are shared. Then I've got another set of 2's that are shared. I only count those ones once. Now I got to deal with all these extra numbers. So I'm going to multiply by 2 again, by 2 a third time, by 2 another time. And then I got to deal with that 5. So that ends up with a total of 5 2's multiplied by each other, and then a 5 as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to multiply that out. 2 times 2, 4, times 2 is going to give me 8, times 2 is going to give me 16, times 2 is going to give me 32. And that's going to give me, when I multiply it all out, it's 160 because that's times 5. So 160 is going to be the smallest number that both 32 and 20 go into. It's actually 32 times 5 and 20 times 8. So that's the smallest number, that's the least common multiple. So that's how you do least common multiple.